past the Church of St. Margaret's, Westminster, and past the St. Stephen's entrance. There it is, the crown, which is really the most famous symbol of the sovereign's power, with its 3,000 jewels and precious stones. Past Westminster Abbey there on the left-hand side, the Henry VII Chapel, and turning into the sovereign's entrance. On a dry, rather cloudy day here in central London, and then through the main gates, where we will see the Queen arriving in a short while. The Crown Jeweller will be part of this sequence of events, to make sure that the crown itself is taken out and handled carefully. Safely retrieved. Transferred safely. The crown is taken up the royal staircase, and they will wait there for the other insignia. The cap of maintenance there, which is trimmed with ermine, crimson velvet. That is the cap that is the reminder of those monarchs being favoured by the Pope all those years ago. And the Pope would give a cap to those monarchs who were in his favour at the time. And then the Sword of State, dating back to the reign of James II. Another element of the sovereign's authority. All of them brought into the Houses of Parliament for a purpose, a very visible purpose, to remind all those present and all those watching of the monarch's authority in reading that Queen's speech in the House of Lords. Very different scene to previous years, because normally there would be a dismounted detachment of the Household Cavalry on the Blues and Royals and the Lifeguards lining the staircase, lots of them young recruits. They're no longer with us because of the restrictions. Hopefully they'll be back before long. And there you have the most spectacular image of the crown itself. Crown worn by the Queen in 1953 on her coronation day, and taken into the Royal Gallery, past the Yeomen of the Guard who are standing there, ready to accompany it. And it'll be taken into the robing room, just at the far end. You can see the two state trumpeters either side of the doorway. They will be sounding the fanfare when the Queen is ready to process to the House of Lords a little later on. The yeoman place. And unlike the crown, these emblems will be placed on display in the Royal Gallery. And they're being placed on display for a very particular purpose, and that is just to remind people of the sovereign's power. And they will be carried in the procession when the Queen, Prince of Wales make their way from the robing room into the House of Lords a little later on. I mentioned the Prince of Wales. Well, here we have Clarence House, just off St James's Park in central London, and this is the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall making their way. The first of the processions, and these are all members of the main procession, which will take place a little later on. They're all gathering at the top of the royal staircase, ready for the Queen's arrival. So that's what we're now seeing, is all of these groups assembling, ready for the Queen's arrival just before 11:30. And here we have Black Rod. Black Rod will be summoning the MPs a little later on. And Garter, King of Arms, Thomas Woodcock, in his last state opening of Parliament, in charge of all the heraldic guidelines, advises the Queen on those. And then Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's Lord President of the Council, leader of the House of Commons, latest group, and they will go down the staircase ready to greet the Queen when she arrives. Then we have the 17 peers and MPs lining the Royal Gallery. And this is the unmistakable expanse of Horse Guards parade, I think. This is the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall making their way towards the Horse Guards Arch and down onto Whitehall. The new Lord Speaker, John McFall, Lord McFall, who was a former Labour MP for Dumbarton, very well known in the Commons, especially during the financial crisis, because he chaired the Treasury Select Committee at that time, and grilled lots of the bankers who were involved in the controversies of the time. So Lord McFall recently elected to succeed Lord Fowler as Lord Speaker. He presides over sessions of the House of Lords. He's also actually nominally in charge of security and other arrangements for the House of Lords as well, but he is the ultimate authority on events in the House of Lords. Lord McFall will be in place. It's his first state opening, but he's ready for Her Majesty's arrival. The Lord High Chancellor. This is Robert Buckland QC. I think I'm allowed to say that he is the second Lord High Chancellor to come from the Welsh town of Llanelli. The first was Lord Elwyn Jones, who served under Harold Wilson and James Callaghan back in the 70s. Robert Buckland, from a well-known legal family in my part of Wales. He's the MP for Swindon South, and he's in his post and will be part of the procession itself, again for the state opening. A view once again of the Royal Staircase, and the Lord High Chancellor has arrived. And this is the scene outside. Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall being brought to the Palace of Westminster, and they are pretty much on time, just passing Parliament Square and approaching the palace itself. And if we cross central London, and if we go across St James's Park and Green Park, this wonderfully green and beautiful part of central London, we can see Buckingham Palace once again. Approaching the Sovereign's entrance. And in they go, ready for the procession a little later. The Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall will be present in the chamber. They'll be taking their places on those state chairs as the Queen delivers the speech on the throne. welcomed by the Marquess of Cholmondeley, Lord Chamberlain, who's in charge of the royal parts of the Palace of Westminster, including Westminster Hall and the Royal Gallery and the Robing Room, and exchanging a few words with regard to King of Arms. Prince of Wales no doubt aware that it's the last state opening for Thomas Woodcock, who's been in post for several years. And there you have the scene from inside the Royal Gallery. And if we take a look inside the House of Lords, where most of those who've secured places are now in place, and a range of people. There's Lord Forsyth, that's Michael Forsyth, who was Scottish Secretary, and John Major. Angela Smith, the former Labour Minister. And we have Lord Newby there, the Lib Dem leader in the Lords. He's in place representing his party. And while the peers wait, the MPs and other peers are waiting next door, well, just about next door, in the Royal Gallery itself. On either side, 17 peers and 17 members of Parliament, who, unlike the peers in the chamber, who are there for specific reasons, these have been competitive. They put their names into a ballot. So I'm just thinking, Laura, at this point, it's interesting to note from the selection of people there who was keen to come. They include, for example, Lord Lamont, who's there, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer. They include Lord Hannan, Daniel Hannan, the former MEP, and a range of people from the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And I think it's fair to say that after us, given the fact that we can see everything from here, they've not got a bad view, have they? Really? It's not too bad.
I think they probably have the best view in the house, and especially actually because there's so few people there this year. Normally for our viewers we can remind them that this place is absolutely packed during a normal state opening. You can hardly sort of get a seat. Every single nook and cranny is packed everywhere, not least because quite often the female guests are wearing enormous hats. So if there's the wrong person sitting in front of you, you might not be able to see anything at all. But how strange it is though also to see it like that. Quite eerie in a sense.
Joanne, here she is, Her Majesty once again undertaking her duty. Her sense of duty, of course, is unshakable. And on her way to Horse Guards, past the Guards Memorial there, on the right-hand side of the cavalcade, ready to cross the expanse of Horse Guards, and they'll be down at Parliament within a few minutes' time. Back in Central Lobby, the Inspector, ready to tell strangers to take their hats off, in other words, non-members, to show respect for the Speaker. Waiting for the signal. Speaker's procession happens every day that the Commons is in session. This same procedure.
Hats off, strangers!
Very familiar scene for those who watch the state opening, but for all of those visitors who come to the Houses of Parliament. the Sergeant-at-Arms leading the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, the MP for Chorley, originally elected as a Labour MP, but now, of course, not a party-aligned MP as Speaker. Sir Lindsay, whose father was a Labour MP before him, Doug Hoyle, is now a member of the House of Lords. So the announcements of the Speaker's on the way, down towards the members' lobby of the House of Commons, preceded by the Sergeant-at-Arms. We heard from him a little while ago. Past Churchill on the left and Lloyd George on the right. And into the chamber where there will be prayers, and that will signal the closing of the doors. And here's the Queen arriving in the Palace of Westminster at the Sovereign's entrance. We have the Victoria Tower and the Victoria Gardens there on the banks of the River Thames, with the Union flag flying, soon to be replaced by the Royal Standard, which is the sign that the Queen has arrived in the Palace of Westminster. And there we have the Royal Standard flying in the breeze, and the Union flag being taken down. And as soon as the Queen leaves a little later, we'll have the reverse of that process. So the Royal Standard now signalling to anyone who's passing in London, and indeed to the rest of the country if they're watching these pictures, that the Queen is at the Palace of Westminster and is ready for the state opening of 2021. The London Eye just in the background there on the left, and the old County Hall, St Thomas's Hospital across the river from the Houses of Parliament. And a good image there of Big Ben shrouded in that scaffolding. The Garter King of Arms, normally leading the heralds, and Her Majesty having made her way up to the robing room with the Marquis of Cholmondeley. Inside the Royal Gallery, those taking part in the procession, including the Lord Speaker and the Lord High Chancellor, will now start to form up, along with Black Rod, ready for this to take place, and the Duke of Norfolk, the Earl Marshal, who's in charge of all great state events involving state openings, or indeed coronations and funerals. One of the great officers of state. The state trumpeters in place, ready to sound the fanfare. So, a shorter wait probably than usual, because the Queen will not be wearing the state robes or the crown. So just a few last minute conversations before the procession is underway. And as Laura was saying earlier, those present in the Royal Gallery will have the best view of the day, I suspect, because they will be within a few feet of Her Majesty as she makes her way down to the House of Lords, Prince of Wales too, and the Duchess of Cornwall. We have representatives here of the armed forces, of the royal households, and of course the great offices reflecting the tradition of the royal family and the great royal palaces going back over centuries. And on either side of the door, rather poignantly on the left, a great portrait of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, whose funeral took place just a few weeks ago. And that funeral indeed was the last major public engagement undertaken by the Queen before today. The Queen's portrait just on the right-hand side, and then as the trumpeters are ready to sound the fanfare, above the trumpeters we also have a portrait of King George VI, the Queen's father, who died at a young age, and of course that meant that the Queen ascended the throne at a very young age. celebrates the battles of Waterloo and Trafalgar, which line the walls of the Royal Gallery. And the procession is about to get underway. So this state opening of Parliament of May 2021 gets underway with the Prince of Wales accompanying Her Majesty the Queen in procession behind the imperial state crown, which is the great symbol of the Queen's authority. Duchess of Cornwall just following behind the Prince and Her Majesty. Queen will enter the House of Lords, and in a pattern that is now extremely familiar to Her Majesty, given that this is her 67th state opening. We passed the statue of Queen Victoria, enter the Lords, and will take her place on the great throne. And will then give the signal for the House of Commons to be summoned. Crown being brought into the House of Lords, everyone stands. And they will await the Queen's signal.
My lords, pray be seated.
Signal has been given, and it's been received in the central lobby. And Blackrod on her way to summon the MPs. The monarch's representative, and in the tradition, will have to knock on the door of the House of Commons. A reminder of the days when the monarch tried to arrest some members of Parliament.
Mr. Speaker, the Queen commands. House of Peers.
A few words lost there, but we are familiar, of course, with the words of Blackrod to attend Her Majesty in the House of Peers. In other words, they are summoned. Sergeant-at-Arms and Blackrod leading the way, and there we have the Prime Minister on the left-hand side on the government benches. The Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, part of this rather small group of MPs making their way today. Prime Minister followed by Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader. And there we have Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, Ian Blackford for the Scottish National Party. just bring Laura in here, because normally, Laura, of course, the Prime Minister and opposition leader would be chatting and walking together.
They
So
would.
this is a very different setup.
It's a very different setup, or they would be walking together, but sometimes actually not chatting, which was always also rather interesting when you saw the level of tensions between the main opposition and the governing party. But just watching Boris Johnson there with Keir Starmer several paces behind, both of them, of course, in the last few days, dealing with the aftermath of a huge set of election results from right across the country, the Conservatives having huge success in much of England, the Labour Party having a very difficult time. That's not to say that the government is also free of headaches. You know, that constitutional argument that we've already been referring to is very much also on the government's mind. But also just interesting to see the new Labour Chief Whip there, Alan Campbell,
Yes.
in his place, with the veteran Chief Whip Nick Brown having been removed as part of this reshuffle, and Labour's turmoil in recent days also surely must be on Keir Starmer's mind.
Members of the House of Commons, my government's priority is to deliver a national recovery from the pandemic that makes the United Kingdom stronger, healthier and more prosperous than before. To achieve this, my government will level up opportunities across all parts of the United Kingdom, supporting jobs, businesses and economic growth, and addressing the impact of the pandemic on public services. My government will protect the health of the nation, continuing the vaccination programme and providing additional funding to support the NHS. My ministers will bring forward legislation to empower the NHS to innovate and embrace technology. Patients will receive more tailored and preventative care closer to home. Measures will be brought forward to support the health and well-being of the nation, including to tackle obesity and improve mental health. Proposals on social care reform will be brought forward. My government will build on the success of the vaccination programme to lead the world in life sciences, pioneering new treatments against diseases like cancer and securing jobs and investment across the country. My ministers will oversee the fastest ever increase in public funding for research and development and pass legislation to establish an advanced research agency. Following the unprecedented support provided to businesses during the pandemic, proposals will be brought forward to create and support jobs and improve regulation. My government will strengthen the economic ties across the Union, investing in and improving national infrastructure. Proposals will be taken forward to transform connectivity by rail and bus, and to extend 5G mobile coverage and gigabit-capable broadband. Legislation will support a lifetime skills guarantee to enable flexible access to high-quality education and training throughout people's lives. Measures will be introduced to ensure that support for businesses reflects the United Kingdom's strategic interests and drives economic growth. Laws will simplify procurement in the public sector. 8 new free ports will create hubs for trade and help regenerate communities. My government will ensure that the public finances are returned to a sustainable path once the economic recovery is secure. Measures will be brought forward to ensure that children have the best start in life, prioritising their early years. My ministers will address lost learning during the pandemic and ensure every child has a high-quality education and is able to fulfil their potential. My government will help more people to own their own home while enhancing the rights of those who rent. Laws to modernise the planning system so that more homes can be built will be brought forward, along with measures to end the practice of ground rents for new leasehold properties. My ministers will establish in law a new building safety regulator to ensure that the tragedies of the past are never repeated. Measures will be brought forward to address racial and ethnic disparities and ban conversion therapy. Legislation will support the voluntary sector by reducing unnecessary bureaucracy and releasing additional funds for good causes. My government will invest in new green industries to create jobs while protecting the environment. The United Kingdom is committed to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and will continue to lead the way internationally by hosting the COP26 summit in Glasgow. Legislation will set binding environmental targets. Legislation will also be brought forward to ensure the United Kingdom has and promotes the highest standards of animal welfare. My government will strengthen and renew democracy and the Constitution. Legislation will be introduced to ensure the integrity of elections, protect freedom of speech, and restore the balance of power between the executive, legislature, and the courts. My ministers will promote the strength and integrity of the Union. Measures will be brought forward to strengthen devolved government in Northern Ireland and address the legacy of the past. My government will introduce measures to increase the safety and security of its citizens. Legislation will increase sentences for the most serious and violent offenders and ensure the timely administration of justice. Proposals will be brought forward to address violence, including against women and girls, and to support victims. Measures will be brought forward to establish a fairer immigration system that strengthens the United Kingdom's borders and deters criminals who facilitate dangerous and illegal journeys. My government will lead the way in ensuring internet safety for all, especially for children, whilst harnessing the benefits of a free, open and secure internet. My ministers will provide our gallant armed services with the biggest spending increase in 30 years, taking forward their programme of modernisation and reinforcing the United Kingdom's commitment to NATO. My ministers will honour and strengthen the Armed Forces Covenant, placing it in law. Measures will be introduced to provide national insurance contribution relief for employers of veterans. Legislation will be introduced to counter hostile activity by foreign states. My ministers will implement the integrated review of security, defence, development and foreign policy. The United Kingdom will host the G7 summit and lead the global effort to secure a robust economic recovery from the pandemic. My ministers will deepen trade ties in the Gulf, Africa and the Indo-Pacific. My government will continue to provide aid where it has the greatest impact on reducing poverty and alleviating human suffering. My government will uphold human rights and democracy across the world. It will take forward a global effort to get 40 million girls across the world into school. Members of the House of Commons, estimates for the public services will be laid before you. My Lords and members of the House of Commons, other measures will be laid before you. I pray that the blessing of Almighty God may rest upon your councils.
The Lord High Chancellor acknowledges that the Queen has ended the reading of the Queen's speech, and the Marquis of Cholmondeley brings back the Imperial State Crown for the procession through the Prince's Gallery and back to the Royal Gallery and to the robing room. Relatively brief in terms of duration, as the Queen's speech usually is, but that touched a lot of themes, and there were some brief sentences there which actually were references to major pieces of legislation, or certainly major potential areas for legislation, which we'll discuss in a moment. Peers are on their feet as the Queen leads, and the procession, led by the Crown, through the Prince's chamber and back into the Royal Gallery itself. Prince of Wales escorting his mother, Her Majesty the Queen, followed by the Duchess of Cornwall. Crown, which will be returned to the Tower of London. As will the other regalia that we saw earlier, the Sword of State and the Cap and Maintenance. The Queen looking carefully around the Royal Gallery and no doubt reflecting on the fact that it is not full of 600 diplomatic guests and representatives of the armed forces and peers guests as it normally is. It's a very, very different site and a very different feel. And here we have the members returning. That's Sir Geoffrey Donaldson there from the Unionists of Northern Ireland, as one of the small band of MPs who made their way. Sir Ed Davey for the Lib Dems, Ian Blackford for the SNP, and in they come back into the chamber. The chamber, of course, in the next few days will be dealing with the content of the Queen's speech. There will be a debate. Prime Minister having just nipped out past the Speaker's chair and back to where the Prime Minister's suite of offices lies, just behind there in the corridors behind the chair, and no doubt reflecting on a rather brief ceremonial event today. But I have to say, Laura, and I'll come to our guests as well, you know, I marked several things, and we won't have time to discuss all of them, but just a couple of things that I wanted to pick up. My government will strengthen and renew democracy and the Constitution. Renew democracy, which is quite a big idea, and the Constitution, and legislation will be introduced to ensure the integrity of elections. Now, does that refer to ID?
I think it refers to two things. First of all, the Conservative Manifesto said that there would be a review of judicial reviews, essentially looking at whether the balance between people taking things to court that might bleed into the political arena and what actually happens in this place now.